Japan's had the same royal family on the throne for over 1,500 years. No coups, no replacements, just one continuous dynasty. Here's the twist, though. For most of the last 500 years, that family barely held any real power. Someone else was always running the show, working out exactly who took some digging, assassinations, exploding temples, invading fleets, one guy who showed up with cannons and rewrote the rules entirely. So let's rewind 5 centuries. Watch Japan go from a country literally on fire to one of the most powerful economies on the planet. We start in 1467. Japan's ruler is the shogun, basically a military dictator with much better robes. This particular shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, has a problem. No heir, so he talks his little brother into becoming his successor. Great plan. Except almost immediately after that, his wife has a baby boy.
Wait, so I'm not shogun anymore? Yeah, funny story. Surprise, baby.
Your family seeks to undermine the emperor's authority. It is your taxes that starve the people.
Our son is the real heir. Fight me!
Can everyone just please stop yelling in my house?
Nobody stopped yelling. 2 of Japan's most powerful noble families, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, backed opposite claimants. The disagreement exploded into a full-blown war, fought right in the capital. For 10 straight years, both sides burned each other's neighborhoods of Kyoto to the ground. By 1477, it fizzled out. Nobody really remembered what they'd been fighting about. Most of Kyoto was ash and rubble, and, more importantly, nobody believed the shogun controlled anything outside his own front gate. Oh, and the emperor? Still living quietly in Kyoto this whole time. Still technically Japan's supreme sacred ruler. He did absolutely nothing to stop any of it. Keep an eye on this guy. We'll check back in. So the shogun's authority evaporates. Japan splits into a few hundred competing mini-kingdoms, each run by a local warlord called a daimyo. This kicks off the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, a century and a half of daimyo backstabbing, besieging, and marrying off their kids for 5 minutes of peace. Everyone builds castles on hilltops. Everyone hires more samurai than they can afford. Loyalty gets thin fast. Retainers overthrow their own lords. Ambitious nobodies from minor families claw their way up by force. It's a pattern so common that historians later coin a phrase for it. Roughly, the low overthrowing the high. No family's position is safe for more than a generation. Picture the map of Japan redrawn constantly. Territory flipping hands, alliances made and shattered within a single season. One young daimyo makes his name early, with an upset nobody saw coming. In 1560, a warlord named Imagawa Yoshimoto marches a huge army toward the capital. He expects an easy win over a minor lord named Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga's badly outnumbered. He doesn't wait behind his walls. Instead, he ambushes Imagawa's resting army during a sudden storm at a place called Okehazama and kills him outright.
My lord, we are outnumbered 10 to 1. This is suicide. Then we'd better not fight fair.
Overnight, Nobunaga goes from an unknown minor lord to a name every daimyo in Japan suddenly fears. Rival lords start double-checking their alliances. A few years earlier, in 1543, something had already washed ashore that would change the entire game. A Portuguese ship, blown badly off course, landing on the tiny island of Tanegashima. On board, matchlock guns, a weapon nobody in Japan had ever seen before. Japanese blacksmiths reverse-engineered them almost immediately. They improved the design within a few years. Within a few decades, Japanese armies were fielding more firearms per soldier than most of Europe. Nobunaga was about to become the first daimyo to figure out exactly what to do with them. Nobunaga, more than anyone, figures out how to actually use them. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he lines up thousands of gunners behind wooden barricades in rotating volleys, and shreds one of the best cavalry forces in the country.
Cavalry charge! Nothing stops a good cavalry charge. Cool story. We brought guns. Reload!
Nobunaga tears through central Japan after that, burning rival strongholds, executing anyone who crosses him twice. He even besieges armed Buddhist monasteries that dared oppose him. These were entire fortified temple complexes. Some had run like independent armies for over a century. No jokes here. The campaigns are genuinely brutal. Thousands die as Nobunaga consolidates power province by province. Still, it works. He gets closer to unifying the whole country than anyone has in over a century. The map starts turning one color for the first time in generations. But in 1582, disaster. One of Nobunaga's own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turns on him without warning. He surrounds Nobunaga's lodgings at Honno-ji Temple, with soldiers loyal to Akechi alone. Nobunaga's cornered, no escape route, no reinforcements within a day's march. He sets the temple alight and takes his own life, rather than let his enemies capture him.
Lord Nobunaga, we're here for your surrender. Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Enter Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's most talented general, a former peasant who clawed his way up through pure competence in a society that supposedly didn't allow that. Nobunaga used to mock him, calling him monkey for his looks. Hideyoshi apparently never forgot it. He avenges his old boss, crushing the traitor Akechi within 2 weeks. Then he quietly inherits Nobunaga's unfinished project. Every other rival general is still scrambling to react. By the time they do, Hideyoshi already has momentum nobody can match. By 1590, he's done what nobody managed in over a century of trying. He unifies essentially all of Japan under a single ruler. The whole map, one color, for the first time since before the Onin War even started. Once he's on top, Hideyoshi locks the new order in place. 2 blunt policies. First, a nationwide land survey, so the government finally knows who owns what and who owes what in taxes. Second, the sword hunt. He orders peasants across the country to hand over their weapons. His logic is simple. Farmers farm, soldiers fight, and nobody gets to be both anymore. It's the quiet policy move that finally kills off decades of peasant uprisings. And it works. Hideyoshi, feeling unstoppable, decides Japan's destiny is to conquer Korea, and eventually China after that. He launches 2 massive invasions of Korea through the 1590s. Japanese forces advance fast at first, but Korean resistance stiffens. Ming China sends reinforcements to defend its ally, and Korean Admiral Yi Sun-sin repeatedly wrecks Japanese supply fleets at sea, using ingeniously armored turtle ships. The whole campaign grinds into a brutal, years-long stalemate. Hideyoshi dies in 1598 without ever fixing his Korea problem. He leaves behind a 5-year-old heir and a power vacuum the exact size of the entire country. That vacuum gets settled on one extremely bloody afternoon, October 1600, the Battle of Sekigahara. On one side, loyalists defending Hideyoshi's young son. On the other, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the last of Japan's 3 great unifiers. By far the most patient man in Japanese history. He'd spent decades quietly building alliances while Nobunaga and Hideyoshi did all the fighting. Roughly 160,000 soldiers face off that day. It's one of the largest battles ever fought on Japanese soil. Ieyasu wins decisively when several of his rivals' allies flip sides mid-battle. Tens of thousands of troops suddenly turn against their own side in a single afternoon.
You could go down with the losing side today, or you could switch to us, right now, while it's still an option. When you put it that way.
By nightfall, Sekigahara has done more than decide a battle. It's decided who rules Japan, and unlike Nobunaga and Hideyoshi before him, Ieyasu is about to make sure it stays decided. Ieyasu becomes shogun in 1603. He moves the real center of power to a small fishing town called Edo, which you now know as Tokyo. The map changes one final time. One shogun, one family, running the entire country. And this time, unlike every previous attempt in the last century and a half, it actually sticks. For 250 years. There's an old saying that sums up all 3 unifiers perfectly. If a cuckoo refuses to sing, Nobunaga kills it. Hideyoshi finds a way to make it sing. Ieyasu just waits, however long it takes, until it sings on its own. Same goal, 3 completely different personalities. And the patient one ended up founding the dynasty that lasted longest. Meanwhile, the emperor, still in Kyoto, still technically the supreme ruler on paper, still doing absolutely nothing. Incredible brand consistency. To keep that peace intact, the Tokugawa shoguns get paranoid about outside influence, especially European missionaries stirring up converts, and they worry, foreign armies to go with them. So starting in the 1630s, they slam the door almost completely shut. Foreign travel is banned. Christianity is outlawed, only a small number of Dutch and Chinese traders are allowed in, and only through one tiny artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor. Japan calls this policy Sakoku. The closed country.
Foreigners are banned from Japan, effective immediately. What about us? We're already here. You get one island. Don't leave it. Don't bring priests.
Policies tested almost immediately. In 1637, tens of thousands of poor farmers and persecuted Christians in southern Japan rise up, the Shimabara Rebellion. They're furious over crushing taxes and religious persecution. The shogunate crushes the revolt within months. Afterward, it locks the borders down even tighter than before. For the next 2.5 centuries, Japan goes quiet, at least by its own standards. Samurai become paper-pushing bureaucrats living on fixed rice stipends since there's nothing left to fight over. Society gets locked into a rigid caste system. Samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants in that exact order, whether you liked your rank or not. Ironically, merchants at the bottom of that list often end up the richest people in the country. And with all that peace and boredom, Japanese culture absolutely explodes. Kabuki theater, woodblock prints, haiku poetry, all flourishing behind a sealed border, while the rest of the planet has no idea what's happening inside. This era also produces one of Japan's most enduring legends. In the early 1700s, a group of 47 samurai avenges their disgraced lord. Years after his death, then they calmly turn themselves in to be executed for it. It becomes the ultimate story of loyalty over self-preservation, retold in plays and prints for the next 3 centuries. Then, in 1853, the outside world barges back in. Whether Japan likes it or not, American Commodore Matthew Perry sails 4 heavily armed steam warships straight into Edo Bay. He delivers a blunt message: open your ports to trade, or we'll open them for you.
We'd love to trade with Japan. We'll come back next year for your answer. And if we say no? I've got 4 warships. You've got 0. Think it over.
Japan says yes. It doesn't have much of a choice. But the shogunate signs a string of humiliating trade deals that heavily favor foreign powers. Furious samurai across the country start asking questions out loud.
Why does an unelected military dictatorship get to make that call for everyone?
The rallying cry becomes revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. And suddenly that guy in Kyoto, ignored for 2.5 centuries, is very relevant again. By 1868, that anger boils over into a short, sharp civil war. The shogunate loses for good. For the first time in over 700 years, real political power gets handed back to the emperor himself. He's a 15-year-old named Mutsuhito who takes the reign name Meiji.
Your Majesty, you're finally in charge of the country.
Great. What exactly do I do?
Modernize the entire nation. Starting today, ideally.
Okay. Anything else?
Also move to Tokyo. Kyoto's a bit small for this.
And Japan modernizes at a genuinely insane speed. The new government ships dozens of its own officials abroad for nearly 2 years. It becomes known as the Iwakura Mission. They tour American factories and European parliaments, taking frantic notes on everything worth stealing for the homeland. Samurai lose their swords and their special legal status almost overnight. Plenty of them are furious about it, some rebel outright. The government crushes them just as fast. The new government builds railways, a Western-style conscript army and navy, universal public schools, and a written constitution by 1889. 20 years earlier, Japan had swordsmen and shogunates. Now, it has battleships, telegraph lines, and a parliament. That brand new military gets tested fast. Japan crushes China in a war over influence in Korea in 1894 and 1895. Then it shocks the entire world in 1904 and 1905 by defeating Russia, a major European empire. It's the first Asian power in the modern era to beat a Western one, both on land and at sea. The map changes again. Japan picks up Taiwan and dominant influence over Korea, plus a permanent seat at the table of world powers. These were nations that had dismissed it as backward just a generation earlier. Japan formally annexes Korea outright in 1910. Over the next 2 decades, elected civilian leaders keep losing ground to an increasingly aggressive military. Japan has almost no oil or iron of its own, and the military is hungry for resources. It's increasingly convinced Japan's destiny is to dominate the entire region by force. Assassinations of moderate politicians become disturbingly common. By the 1930s, Army and Navy officers effectively set foreign policy, whether the civilian cabinet agrees or not. In 1931, the Japanese army manufactures an excuse to invade Manchuria in northern China. It sets up a puppet state there, ignoring objections from its own civilian government back home. Full-scale war with China follows in 1937. That same year, Japanese forces capture the city of Nanjing. They carry out weeks of mass killings and atrocities against soldiers and civilians alike. Historians still argue over the exact death toll, but every serious estimate runs into at least the tens of thousands, and many credible estimates put it far higher. It remains one of the darkest chapters of the entire war, and nothing about it is funny. Japan keeps expanding through Southeast Asia and across the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, it launches a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. That pulls the United States fully into World War II. For a few months, the Japanese Empire controls a genuinely staggering stretch of the map. It stretches from the edges of India to the doorstep of Australia. Then, in June 1942, the tide turns hard. At the Battle of Midway, American code breakers and dive bombers sink 4 irreplaceable Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day. Japan spends the rest of the war losing ground it can never win back. By 1945, American forces are pushing back island by island. Firebombing raids are devastating Japanese cities one after another. A single night of bombing kills tens of thousands of civilians in Tokyo alone. In August, the United States drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, the only nuclear weapons ever used in war. Together, they kill well over 100,000 people. The toll keeps climbing for months afterward. From burns and radiation sickness, Japan surrenders days later. Most Japanese citizens had never even heard Emperor Hirohito's voice before. In a radio broadcast, he told the country,
"The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage."
Somewhere, a historian, that's certainly one way to phrase total defeat. General Douglas MacArthur takes charge of the American occupation. He disarms Japan's military completely. He also helps draft a new constitution in 1947. It renounces war and hands real political power to an elected parliament. The emperor stays on the throne, but he formally renounces any claim to divine status. 1,500 years of imperial mystique quietly walked back in a single radio address. Japan spends the next 2 decades rebuilding from literal rubble, and it does so at a pace that leaves economists baffled. Factories rebuild faster than anyone predicted. A surge of American procurement contracts during the Korean War next door helps too. That war effectively jumpstarts Japanese industry almost overnight. Made in Japan, once a punchline for cheap knockoffs, quietly starts meaning something completely different. Companies overhaul quality control from the ground up. Exports of cars, cameras, and electronics boom through the 1950s and 60s. By 1964, Tokyo, flattened by firebombing less than 20 years earlier, is confident enough to host the Summer Olympics, complete with brand new bullet trains. It's a very deliberate statement to the world. We're back, and we're not the country you remember from 1945. By the late 1960s, Japan's economy rockets past West Germany's. It's 500 years since 2 feuding noble families burned Kyoto to the ground, all over who'd inherit a job nobody could agree on. Now Japan's economy is one of the largest on the entire planet, trailing only the United States. 500 years, from a burning capital to warring daimyo, from gunpowder and unification to 2.5 centuries sealed off from the world, from forced reopening to empire to catastrophe to a genuine economic miracle. And Japan, in the late 1960s, was only just getting started. That's 500 years of Japanese history in 15 minutes. Next time, how a country with almost no natural resources turned itself into a global tech and pop culture powerhouse. Subscribe so you don't miss it.